Hello, lovely souls, and welcome to Emily Whispers. I'm Emily, and I'm so happy you decided to join me tonight. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment and say hello. I love connecting with each of you. If these little moments bring you peace, please like and subscribe so we can share more of them together. Now find your cozy spot. Wrap yourself in a blanket if you like. Take a slow, gentle breath, and let's drift into tonight's story. I had driven the route from Chicago to Memphis 100 times over the past decade. As a long-haul trucker, Interstate 55 South was as familiar to me as the back of my own hands. I knew every way station, every cheap diner, and every spot where the highway patrol liked to hide, which is exactly why what happened on that January night in 2022 still makes the hair on my arms stand up and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the roads I traveled the day had started normally enough. I left Chicago around 2 in the afternoon, planning to reach Memphis by morning for an early delivery. The weather was cold but clear, perfect driving conditions for the long haul ahead. I had made this journey so many times that I could practically drive it in my sleep, which made what happened next all the more unsettling. Everything proceeded normally through Illinois. I stopped for fuel in Springfield, just as I always did, grabbing my usual hot coffee and a stale pastry from the convenience store. The clerk was the same young woman who'd been working there for a year, and we exchanged our typical pleasantries about the cold and the long night ahead. By 8 in the evening, I was crossing into Missouri, right on schedule. That was when the world started to feel thin, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. The familiar flatlands along the interstate seemed somehow different. The trees looked wrong somehow, not quite the right shape or type for this part of the country in the darkness. I told myself it was just the unusual moonlight, maybe some atmospheric phenomenon that was playing tricks with my perception. After all, I'd driven this route in every kind of weather and lighting condition imaginable, but then I started noticing the signs, highway markers that didn't quite match what I remembered. Exit signs for towns I'd never heard of, despite driving this route for years. At first, I assumed they were just new housing developments, or perhaps small communities I'd somehow overlooked in all my previous trips. But as I continued driving, the signs became increasingly bizarre. Next exit, Oak Haven, 5 miles. Read one sign. I had never heard of Oak Haven, and it certainly wasn't on my usual route. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed me still traveling south on Interstate 55, exactly where I should be. Yet the landscape around me looked increasingly unfamiliar. The terrain seemed hillier than it should be, lacking the distinctive flat, open fields that characterize this stretch of Missouri highway. Then came the sign that made my stomach feel hollow. Welcome to Illinois. of Lincoln. My foot went to the brake pedal, the truck slowing with a heavy protest as I pulled over to the shoulder. My heart began a fast, hard rhythm in my chest. This was impossible. I'd been driving south for hours. I'd crossed into Missouri and seen the welcome sign. How could I possibly be entering Illinois again? I grabbed my phone to call dispatch, to call anyone, but there was no signal. Not just a weak signal, no signal whatsoever, as if I'd driven into some kind of dead zone. My GPS still showed my location as somewhere on Interstate 55 in Missouri. But the landscape outside my windshield looked nothing like Missouri. In fact, it looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Low, rolling hills covered in a type of pine tree that seemed too dark for this part of the country. Under a sky that had turned a strange shade of deep violet. Despite it being only 9 in the evening, I decided to take the next exit, whatever it was, and try to get my bearings. Maybe I could find a gas station or a diner where I could ask for directions and figure out what was happening. The exit ramp led to a 2-lane road that curved away into the distance, marked only by a generic services sign with no indication of what those services might be. As I drove down the exit ramp, I noticed something that made my blood feel cold. In my side mirror, the interstate I had just left was no longer visible. Not hidden by trees or hills, but simply gone. As if it had never existed, I stopped the truck and got out, walking back toward where the on-ramp should have been. There was nothing but empty road stretching in both directions, with no sign of the interstate I'd just been on. Panic began to set in. I got back in my truck and drove forward, hoping to find some explanation, some landmark that would help me understand where I was. The 2-lane road seemed to go on forever, perfectly straight with no curves or hills. Along the way, I passed signs for places that sounded real but wrong. Clearwater, population 1,802, for a town that was nowhere near any large body of water. Ridgeview, established 1905, in an area completely devoid of ridges. The strangest part was the consistency of it all. This wasn't like a dream where things constantly shifted and changed. Everything remained perfectly stable and realistic, just wrong. The road was well maintained. The signs looked official and weathered as if they'd been there for years. The landscape, while unfamiliar, followed all the normal rules of geography and physics. It was reality, just not the reality I knew after what felt like hours of driving. I began to notice that I was passing the same landmarks repeatedly. A distinctive, rusted-out silo, a cluster of 3 trees that grew in a perfect triangle, a billboard advertising a brand of soda I'd never heard of. At first, I thought they were just similar structures. But as I passed the rusted silo for the 4th time, I had to accept the impossible truth. I was driving in some kind of loop. The fuel gauge became my greatest source of anxiety. I'd filled up in Springfield, but now the needle was approaching empty. In normal circumstances, I would have found a truck stop hours ago. But there were no gas stations here, services of any kind, despite the signs promising them. Just the endless road, the repeating landmarks, and the growing certainty that I was trapped in something that shouldn't exist. I tried everything I could think of. I attempted to turn around and drive back the way I'd come, but the road behind me looked identical to the road ahead. I tried taking what appeared to be side roads, but they all led back to the main road within a few hundred yards. I even tried driving off-road, but my truck would inexplicably lose traction and slide back onto the pavement, no matter how hard I fought the wheel. The most disturbing part was the time. My dashboard clock showed that hours were passing, but my phone, when it occasionally flickered to life, showed a different time entirely. Sometimes my phone would display a time from earlier in the day, sometimes from the next day. The timestamps on the few text messages from my wife that managed to come through were equally nonsensical, as if time itself had become unstable in this place then. As abruptly as it began, it was over. I drove around a bend that I'd taken dozens of times before and found myself staring at a familiar sight. The bright lights of a truck stop I recognized. The GPS coordinates on my phone showed my exact location on Interstate 55 in Mississippi, roughly 200 miles south of where I'd taken that impossible exit. According to my phone, it was 3:30 in the morning, meaning I'd been driving for over 6 hours since my last clear memory. But here's what still terrifies me. According to my truck's trip meter, I'd driven only 127 miles since filling up in Springfield. Yet, I was now 400 miles further along my route than I should have been. The math was impossible. I'd somehow covered more than twice the distance I'd actually driven, with several hours of my life spent in a place that couldn't exist on any map. I never reported the incident to the authorities. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I spent the years since trying to research similar experiences, finding scattered accounts online from other truckers who describe eerily similar encounters with impossible roads and lost time. I've learned that these stories are more common than most people realize, hidden away in the corners of the internet where people share experiences they know sound insane to this day. I still make the drive from Chicago to Memphis for work, but now I never travel alone if I can help it. And I've memorized every landmark, every exit, every mile marker along the way. Because somewhere out there, I know, is a road that leads to nowhere and everywhere at once, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to take that wrong turn into the impossible. I had always considered myself a good judge of character. At 28, I traveled extensively across the Pacific Northwest, picking up hitchhikers when the mood struck me and my instincts told me it was safe. I prided myself on being able to read people quickly, distinguishing between genuine travelers in need and those who might pose a threat. It was a skill I developed over years of cross-country drives. that had never failed me. Until that rainy September afternoon in 1994, when my intuition would prove to be catastrophically wrong in ways I wouldn't discover for months. The day started like any other autumn road trip. I was driving my beat-up station wagon from Seattle to Boise, taking the scenic route through the Cascade Mountains. I'd quit my job at a coffee shop the week before, using my savings to fund what I called my escape tour from the city. The car was loaded with camping gear, a cooler full of cheap soda, and enough optimism to fuel 1,000 miles of adventure somewhere between Portland and the Idaho border. As the afternoon rain beat a steady rhythm on my windshield, I spotted a figure standing beside the road with his thumb extended. The man appeared to be in his 30s, average height and build, wearing a faded blue rain jacket despite the downpour. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, giving him an almost boyish appearance that seemed harmless enough. I slowed the car and pulled over, already feeling good about my decision to help a fellow traveler. The man jogged up to the passenger door with a grateful smile that immediately put me at ease. "Thank God," the hitchhiker said as he climbed into the car. "I've been standing out there for 3 hours. Name's Jack, by the way." Jack settled into the passenger seat with practiced ease, suggesting he was an experienced hitchhiker. He was polite, soft-spoken, and genuinely appreciative of the ride. As we pulled back onto the highway, Jack explained that his truck had broken down about 50 miles back, and he was trying to get to Spokane to stay with his sister while he figured out his next move. The story was plausible, delivered without any of the nervousness or over-explanation that I had learned to associate with people who weren't being truthful. What struck me most about Jack was how normal he seemed. Not just normal, but actually pleasant company. Jack had an easy way of making conversation without being intrusive or overly personal. He asked thoughtful questions about my travels, shared interesting observations about the landscape we were passing through, and even had a good sense of humor when I mentioned I was a bit hungry. Jack offered to share some snacks he'd bought at the last gas station, pulling out packages of trail mix and beef jerky from a well-worn backpack as the miles rolled by. I found myself genuinely enjoying Jack's company. The hitchhiker seemed well-read and had apparently traveled extensively throughout the western United States. He told engaging stories about various places he'd been, from the forests of California to the plains of Montana. Jack had a particular talent for describing the small, quirky details that made each location memorable. The way the morning mist settled in certain valleys, the sound of rivers in different regions, the friendliness or suspicion of locals in various small towns. Jack also demonstrated an impressive knowledge of practical travel skills. He knew which diners had the best coffee, which stretches of highway were most likely to have rock slides, and which camping areas offered the best combination of scenery and safety. When my car started making a strange squealing noise, Jack correctly diagnosed it as a loose fan belt and showed me how to temporarily fix it using a piece of cord from his backpack. conversation flowed so naturally that I almost forgot I was giving a ride to a complete stranger. Jack asked about my background, my plans for the future, and my reasons for taking this particular trip. In return, Jack shared what seemed like genuine insights about his own life, his struggles to find steady work, his love of being on the road, and his philosophy about the freedom that came from not being tied down to any particular place or routine. As evening approached, I faced a decision. My original plan had been to drive straight through to Boise, but Jack's destination of Spokane was about an hour north of that route. Without hesitation, I offered to take Jack all the way to Spokane, even though it meant adding extra miles and time to my own journey. Jack was grateful, but insisted he didn't want to impose. The ensuing conversation revealed more of Jack's character. He seemed genuinely considerate about inconveniencing others and offered to contribute gas money, which I politely declined. We reached Spokane just as the sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. Jack directed me to a modest residential neighborhood where he said his sister lived. As we pulled up to a small house with a well-maintained front yard, Jack gathered his belongings and thanked me profusely for the ride. He even insisted on writing down my address so he could send a thank you card, a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and genuine. Before getting out of the car, Jack made an observation that would stick with me for years to come. "You know," Jack said, looking directly at me with those calm, intelligent eyes, "you're a good person for picking up strangers. Most people are too suspicious these days, too afraid of everyone they don't know. But you can tell a lot about someone's character by how they treat people who can't do anything for them in return." I watched Jack walk up to the front door, where a woman answered, apparently recognizing him, and I felt satisfied that I'd successfully helped someone reach their destination safely. As I drove away, I reflected on what a pleasant surprise the encounter had been. In a world where people often warned against picking up hitchhikers, Jack had been proof that there were still decent people out there who sometimes just needed a helping hand. The encounter faded into the background of my memory as I continued my travels and eventually returned to a more conventional lifestyle. I got a job, started a family, and settled into a career that required less wandering and more stability. Occasionally, when the topic of travel or hitchhiking came up in conversation, I would mention my positive experience with Jack as an example of how most people are fundamentally good if you give them a chance. That comfortable belief lasted until March of 1995, nearly 8 months after our encounter. I was reading the morning newspaper when a headline caught my attention. "Confessed serial killer linked to multiple highway murders." The story detailed the arrest of a 31-year-old drifter who had confessed to killing at least 15 people across multiple states between 1993 and 1994. As I read the article, a cold realization began to settle in my stomach. The physical description matched: average height and build, dark hair, early 30s. But it was the name that made my blood run cold. The suspect was named Jack. My hands shook as I continued reading. The article detailed his method of operation. He would hitchhike between states, targeting other hitchhikers, campers, and travelers who stopped to help him. He was particularly known for his ability to appear completely normal and trustworthy, often spending hours or even days with potential victims before revealing his true nature. Several survivors described him as articulate, knowledgeable about travel, and possessing an almost magnetic personality that made people want to help him. The timeline matched perfectly. According to the article, Jack had been active throughout the autumn of 1994, traveling extensively through Washington, Idaho, and surrounding states. Several of his confirmed victims had been found along highways in the exact areas where I had picked him up. The dates of some attacks fell within days of my encounter with the hitchhiker. But perhaps most chilling of all was a detail buried deep in the article. One investigator noted that Jack seemed to take particular pleasure in psychological manipulation, sometimes spending extended periods with people who could have become victims, apparently enjoying the power of knowing he could kill them at any moment while they remained completely unaware of the danger they were in. I realized with growing horror that I had spent nearly 6 hours alone in a confined space with one of America's most prolific serial killers. Jack had sat inches away from me, making pleasant conversation and sharing snacks while presumably deciding whether or not to add me to his list of victims. Every laugh we had shared, every thoughtful observation Jack had made, every moment of apparent human connection had been occurring, while a calculating predator evaluated me as potential prey. The knowledge that Jack had specifically commented on my trusting nature took on a sinister new meaning. Had it been a warning, a private joke, or simply the musings of someone who understood exactly how his victims' compassion and willingness to help strangers had made them vulnerable to him? I never learned why Jack had chosen not to kill me that day. Perhaps my change of route to Spokane had disrupted whatever plan he might have had. Perhaps he had decided that my car was too distinctive and memorable for a clean getaway. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, Jack had simply been in a good mood and decided to spare my life on a whim. The revelation fundamentally changed how I viewed human nature and my own judgment. I had prided myself on being able to read people, yet I had spent hours in the company of a serial killer without sensing any danger whatsoever. Jack had been everything I thought a trustworthy person should be: polite, considerate, intelligent, and grateful. The realization that such apparent normalcy could mask such profound evil left me questioning every assumption I'd ever made about my ability to assess people for years afterward. I would wake up in cold sweats, remembering moments from that drive with new understanding. Jack's knowledge of remote camping areas and diner routines now seemed like the professional expertise of a predator. His philosophical comments about trust and human nature felt like the musings of someone who who had extensively studied and exploited those very qualities in his victims. I never picked up another hitchhiker again. Thomas Miller had built what most people would consider a perfect life. At 51, he owned a successful vineyard in the Napa Valley, spanning over 400 acres of prime agricultural land, about an hour north of San Francisco. The Miller family winery had been thriving for years, supplying major restaurant chains across California with high-quality wines. Thomas worked the land alongside his wife, Catherine, 53, and their 3 adult children, David, 25, Sarah, 22, and Emily, 29, to their neighbors and business associates. The Millers appeared to be a close-knit, hard-working family living the California dream. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence, something had begun to go terribly wrong. In the months leading up to August 2016, Thomas had started expressing concerns to family members about being watched and monitored. Initially, these worries seemed relatively minor. Complaints about feeling like their phones were being tapped, or that strangers were asking too many questions about their business operations. Catherine and the children attributed these concerns to stress from running a large agricultural operation during a particularly challenging growing season. However, Thomas's paranoia began to escalate dramatically throughout July and early August. He became convinced that their property was under surveillance by unknown entities, possibly government agencies or criminal organizations. He started checking and rechecking locks, insisting that family members avoid using their cell phones, and expressing beliefs that their internet activity was being monitored. What alarmed the family most was how these concerns seemed to be spreading to other family members, particularly Catherine, who began echoing Thomas's fears about being watched, and followed the situation reached a critical point on August 29th, 2016, when Thomas made an announcement that would shatter his family's world forever. He declared that they needed to leave their property immediately, abandoning everything they had worked for decades to build. Thomas was convinced that staying at the vineyard posed an imminent threat to their safety, though he could never articulate exactly what that threat was or who might be behind it. Most disturbing of all, he insisted that they could not take any electronic devices with them. No cell phones, no GPS units, no credit cards that could be traced. What happened next defied all logic and understanding. Despite having no concrete evidence of any actual threat, the entire Miller family agreed to abandon their successful business and comfortable life to embark on what Thomas described as a necessary escape. On the morning of August 30th, 2016, all 5 family members climbed into their silver sedan, leaving behind their home, their vineyard, their employees, and any means of electronic communication or navigation. The family's initial destination appeared to be Northern Oregon, though Thomas's planning seemed haphazard and paranoid. He had withdrawn a significant amount of cash before their departure, apparently believing that using credit cards would allow whoever was supposedly tracking them to locate their position. Catherine had packed only essential items, and the adult children brought minimal belongings, as if they genuinely believed they might never return home. The journey began ominously. Thomas, who was driving, seemed increasingly agitated as they traveled north from California into Oregon. He frequently checked his mirrors, convinced they were being followed, and took unexpected detours that added hours to their travel time. The family members later described the atmosphere in the car as tense and frightening, with Thomas's paranoia seeming to intensify with each passing mile. By the time they reached Portland, Oregon, approximately 200 kilometers from the California border, the psychological pressure had reached a breaking point. Catherine, who had been supporting her husband's fears throughout the journey, suddenly experienced what can only be described as a complete mental breakdown without warning. She exited the vehicle and began running through the streets of Portland in a state of obvious distress and confusion. Local residents found Catherine wandering aimlessly, unable to explain who she was or why she was there. She appeared disoriented and terrified, speaking incoherently about threats and dangers that only she could perceive. Concerned citizens contacted local police, who quickly determined that Catherine was experiencing some form of psychological crisis. She was taken to a local hospital for evaluation and treatment, becoming the first family member to be separated from the group. Meanwhile, Thomas and the 3 adult children continued their journey without Catherine, though her departure seemed to accelerate the psychological deterioration of the remaining family members. David, the youngest son, later described feeling trapped between his desire to help his obviously distressed father and his growing realization that their situation was spiraling completely out of control. The next family member to separate from the group was David himself. Somewhere between Portland and their next destination, David made the difficult decision to abandon the family's increasingly irrational journey. Unlike his mother's dramatic breakdown, David's departure was more calculated. He managed to contact friends who could help him, and he eventually made his way back towards San Francisco, though he would later require professional counseling to process the trauma of witnessing his family's psychological disintegration. This left Thomas with his 2 daughters, Sarah and Emily, continuing what had become an increasingly desperate and directionless flight from imaginary pursuers. Thomas's driving became more erratic as his paranoia reached new heights. He was convinced that every vehicle behind them was part of an elaborate surveillance operation, and he began taking increasingly remote routes through rural areas of Oregon in an attempt to avoid detection. The psychological contagion that had infected the family reached its most disturbing manifestation in Emily, Thomas's eldest daughter. As they continued their journey, Emily began exhibiting signs of severe dissociation and reality distortion that surpassed even her father's paranoid delusions. she started expressing beliefs that she was no longer herself, that her identity had somehow been compromised or stolen by the same forces her father believed were pursuing them. The situation became critical when they reached the town of Eugene, approximately 280 kilometers south of Portland. Emily's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer distinguish between her internal fears and external reality. In a moment that would haunt the family forever, Emily suddenly exited the vehicle and began running toward a nearby highway, apparently believing that crossing the road would somehow help her escape from whatever psychological prison she found herself trapped within. Tragically, Emily was struck and killed by a truck as she ran toward the highway. Her death represented the ultimate consequence of the mass psychological breakdown that had consumed the Miller family, transforming a successful winery family's inexplicable paranoia into a devastating tragedy that would leave permanent scars on all the survivors. Thomas and Sarah, now reduced to just the two of them, were found by police later that day in a state of severe psychological distress. Both were taken into custody for their own safety and immediately provided with psychiatric evaluation and care. Thomas appeared to have completely lost touch with reality, unable to explain why they had left their vineyard or what they had been running from. Sarah was somewhat more coherent, but clearly traumatized by witnessing her family's disintegration and her sister's death. The investigation that followed revealed no evidence whatsoever of any actual threats to the Miller family. Police thoroughly examined their property, their business records, their personal communications, and their financial situation. No surveillance equipment was found on their property. No threatening communications were discovered. No criminal organizations or government agencies had any interest in the family. Their business was financially stable and legally compliant. There was simply no rational explanation for the fears that had driven them to abandon everything and embark on their tragic journey. Mental health professionals who evaluated the surviving family members diagnosed what appeared to be a case of shared psychotic disorder, also known as folie à deux, though in this case affecting multiple family members simultaneously. This rare condition occurs when delusions and paranoid beliefs spread from one person to others in close contact with them, particularly within families or other tightly connected groups. The stress of running a demanding agricultural business, combined with Thomas's underlying psychological vulnerabilities, appeared to have triggered an initial paranoid episode that then infected other family members through their close emotional bonds and daily interactions. The Miller family tragedy became a case study in how mental illness can spread through family systems and how shared delusions can lead to catastrophic real-world consequences. David, who had separated from the family early in their journey, required months of therapy to process his guilt over not being able to prevent the tragedy. Sarah needed even more extensive treatment to recover from the trauma of witnessing her family's breakdown and her sister's death. Thomas spent considerable time in psychiatric care before gradually recovering enough to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Catherine, who had been the first to be hospitalized, eventually recovered her mental stability, but was left to grapple with the devastating loss of her daughter and the destruction of her family, the vineyard, once a source of pride and prosperity, was eventually sold, as the family could never return to the place where their shared delusions had first taken root. The Miller family case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how psychological contagion can transform a normal family into fugitives from imaginary threats, ultimately leading to real and irreversible tragedy. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that the human mind's capacity for self-deception can be more dangerous than any external threat, and that sometimes the most terrifying enemies are the ones that exist only in our own heads. I had always been a careful driver, the kind of person who planned my routes in advance, kept my gas tank full, and never traveled unfamiliar roads after dark if I could help it. At 34, I worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, which meant I spent considerable time driving between hospitals and clinics across the rural stretches of northern Georgia. My job required me to be practical, observant, and professional, qualities that had served me well in both my career and my personal life. On this particular Tuesday evening in September 2018, I was returning from what should have been a routine client visit in the small town of Blue Ridge, about 3 hours north of Atlanta. I had planned to complete the drive back to my home in Macon during daylight hours, but my final appointment had run longer than expected when the hospital administrator insisted on a detailed walkthrough of their new cardiac wing. By the time I finished my presentation and loaded my sample cases back into my sedan, the sun was already setting behind the Appalachian mountainside. Faced a choice that many solo travelers, particularly women, have to make: take the faster but more isolated route through the backwoods, or stick to the main highways despite the significantly longer drive time. The Interstate would add nearly an hour to my journey, but it offered the safety of consistent traffic, well-lit truck stops, and cell phone coverage. The back roads through the Chattahoochee National Forest would cut my travel time substantially, but they wound through miles of uninhabited forest where a breakdown could leave me stranded, until morning fatigue made the decision for me. I had started my day with a 6 a.m. client meeting in Chattanooga, followed by appointments in 3 different towns. I had been on the road for over 10 hours, surviving on convenience store coffee and protein bars. The thought of adding another hour to my drive felt overwhelming, especially since I had an early morning meeting scheduled in Savannah the next day. Against my better judgment, I decided to take the shortcut through the mountains. The route began innocuously enough, State Route 52, west from Ellijay, was a well-maintained 2-lane highway that connected several small communities in the mountains. I had driven this road before during daylight hours and remembered it as scenic but unremarkable, winding through hardwood forests and past the occasional apple orchard or rural homestead. With my headlights cutting through the growing darkness, I settled into the rhythm of mountain driving, taking the curves at a cautious speed while staying alert for deer or other wildlife that might wander into the roadway. For the first 45 minutes, everything proceeded normally. I passed through the tiny communities of Chatsworth and Dalton, their few street lights providing brief reassurance before I returned to the isolated darkness of the forest road. My phone showed 2 bars of signal strength, enough for emergency use if needed. The fuel gauge indicated I had plenty of gas to reach Macon, and my car was running smoothly despite the demanding mountain terrain. It was just after 9 in the evening when I noticed headlights approaching from behind. In itself, this wasn't unusual. Other travelers used this route, and I'd already passed several vehicles heading in the opposite direction. What caught my attention was how quickly the vehicle was gaining on me. I was driving at a reasonable speed for the conditions, perhaps 5 miles per hour below the posted limit to account for the darkness and unfamiliar curves. The approaching vehicle seemed to be traveling much faster, its headlights growing larger in my rearview mirror with alarming speed. My first instinct was to slow down and move as far right as possible to allow the other driver to pass safely. I assumed it was probably a local resident who knew the road well and was comfortable driving faster than a cautious, out-of-town visitor. As I reduced my speed and hugged the right edge of the roadway, I expected to see the other vehicle swing into the left lane and overtake me at the next safe opportunity. Instead, the vehicle slowed to match my reduced speed, maintaining its position directly behind me. I could see in my mirrors that it appeared to be a pickup truck or SUV, riding high enough that its headlights were nearly at the level of my rear window. The lights were bright, possibly modified with aftermarket bulbs that seemed designed to blind following drivers. What disturbed me most was the deliberate nature of the vehicle's behavior. It was clearly capable of passing me, but the driver seemed to be choosing to stay behind me instead. I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps the other driver was also unfamiliar with the road and was using my car as a guide through the difficult terrain. Maybe they were being cautious about passing on the winding mountain highway and were waiting for a longer straight stretch. I told myself that I was probably overreacting, letting my fatigue and the isolated setting fuel unnecessary anxiety about what was likely an innocent coincidence. But as the miles passed, my unease continued to grow. The vehicle behind me maintained an uncomfortably close following distance, never more than a few car lengths away, despite the challenging driving conditions. When I slowed for particularly sharp curves, the other driver slowed as well. When I accelerated on straight stretches, the vehicle behind me matched my speed perfectly. Most unnervingly, the truck made no attempt to pass, even when we encountered long, straight sections of highway with clear visibility and no oncoming traffic. I tried several subtle tests to gauge the other driver's intentions. I deliberately reduced my speed to well below the limit, hoping the other driver would become impatient and pass me. Instead, the truck slowed to match my pace. I pulled partially onto the shoulder at one point, as if checking something with my car, but the truck simply stopped behind me and waited. When I resumed driving, it resumed following at the same uncomfortably close distance by now. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and I could feel my heart rate increasing. Every instinct was telling me that this was not normal driving behavior. The driver behind me was deliberately shadowing my movements, and I couldn't think of any innocent explanation for such persistent tailgating on an isolated mountain road late at night. The situation escalated dramatically when I came around a bend and found myself on a particularly long, straight stretch of highway. In the distance, I could see what appeared to be a fallen tree and orange cones set up across both lanes of traffic. As I approached, however, something about the scene struck me as wrong. The roadblock appeared to be unmanned, with no workers or equipment visible. More importantly, there were no official vehicles or proper warning signs leading up to the area. I slowed my approach and turned on my hazard lights, trying to assess the situation more carefully. What I saw made my blood run cold. Stretched across the roadway was a heavy chain, suspended between two large, freshly cut logs. It was positioned to force any vehicle to stop, as the orange cones blocked any possibility of driving around it. But this wasn't a legitimate road closure. There were no work crews, no official vehicles, no proper signage, just the chain and cones positioned to look like a natural obstruction in the darkness. As my headlights illuminated the scene more clearly, I realized with growing horror that this was a trap, set up to disable vehicles and leave their occupants stranded in this isolated location. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. The vehicle that had been following me was now directly behind me, its high beam headlights flooding my car with blinding light. I couldn't see who was in the truck, but I could hear its engine making a low, powerful sound, as if preparing to block any attempt I might make to reverse or turn around. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had been herding me toward this trap, using my own car's headlights to guide me into the ambush. In that moment of terrifying clarity, I realized I had perhaps seconds to react before I became a victim of whatever these people had planned. The chain was only about 50 yards ahead, close enough that I couldn't stop safely on the wet mountain road, even if I slammed on my brakes immediately. Behind me, the truck was accelerating, apparently intending to ram me forward into the chain if I tried to stop. I made a split-second decision that probably saved my life. Instead of braking or trying to turn around, I floored the accelerator and aimed my car directly at the narrow gap between the end of the log and the steep, muddy ditch on the right side of the road. My sedan crashed through the makeshift barrier, the undercarriage making a loud sound of complaint as it left the pavement and tore through the underbrush beside the highway. I fought to maintain control as my car bounced and slid over rocks and fallen branches, the bottom of the car taking a beating, but the tires remaining intact in my rearview mirror. I could see the truck that had been following me come to a hard stop beside the chain. Two figures emerged from the vehicle, one of them appearing to shout angrily in my direction. But I was already too far away to make out details. I kept my foot on the accelerator, crashing through small trees and bushes until I found what appeared to be an old logging road that led back toward the main highway. It took me nearly 20 minutes of careful off-road driving to work my way back to pavement, emerging onto a different state route several miles south of where I'd been. My car was damaged but functional, its paint scratched and bumpers dented from the wild ride through the forest. More importantly, I was alive and free, having escaped what I now understood had been a carefully planned ambush by people with unknown, but certainly malicious intentions. I drove directly to the nearest police station, where I reported the incident to officers who took my account seriously, but admitted they had limited ability to investigate without more specific location information or descriptions of the suspects. The remote location, darkness, and my understandable focus on escape had prevented me from gathering details that might have led to arrests. In the days that followed, I learned that I wasn't the first person to report suspicious activity on that stretch of highway. Other drivers had described being followed or encountering unusual roadblocks, though none had come as close as I had to actually being trapped by the chain. Police theorized that I had encountered a robbery crew that used the isolated road to target lone travelers, disabling their vehicles and robbing them in a location where victims would be unlikely to receive help. Quickly, I never learned what would have happened to me if I hadn't escaped, and I preferred not to think about it too deeply. The experience fundamentally changed how I approached travel, particularly alone and at night. I invested in better emergency communication equipment, modified my work schedule to avoid late-night driving, and never again took shortcuts through remote areas without informing someone of my exact route and expected arrival time. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts completely, the subtle signs that had alerted me to danger, the unusual following behavior, the suspicious timing, the improperly marked roadblock, had provided just enough warning to save my life. I often wondered how many other travelers had encountered similar traps on lonely roads, and how many had been less fortunate in their ability to recognize and escape the danger in time. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, lovely souls. I hope this story brought you a moment of calm and curiosity. I'd love to know what part of the story stayed with you the most. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. I always love hearing from you. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue exploring these quiet moments together. Now, take one last deep, gentle breath. Get cozy and let the calm of the night carry you softly until we meet again.